Already, I'm Michael. I'm one of the incoming trustees, so I'm not currently a trustee, but I am in like a month.
Will we see?
So if you haven't met me, it would be lovely to meet you. Come say hi. But I'm just here to invite Ashwin up to continue what he's been talking throughout and bring us our next talk. So Ashwin.
Thank you. So I guess the good news is that I'm halfway done. I've released for myself. I'm just, and the other good news is after this, I have one final assignment. I must admit, as a South African and a South Afrikaans speaker, I could make all of those sounds without needing an introduction. Really? I could say the wait, what was it? And because I'm in the process of learning isiXhosa, which is one of the indigenous languages in the country, because we have 12 official languages in South Africa, including South African Sign Language, and we have English, of course, as one language, and then Afrikaans. Okay, I won't go through the entire list now, but depending on where you live, this would most likely be the language that you speak. So I could make all of those sounds, and yeah. So in maybe I should do that. In Xhosa, there are 3 clicks. The one is a the Bishop of Lesotho, it's not it's a sound. That's not a click. But there's a, and then there is a C sound, which is a, and then there is the hard click, which is a Q sound, which is a. So while I'm now in the process of learning isiXhosa, oh, that was the 3rd click. The X sound is a. While I'm learning isiXhosa, I am required to differentiate between these clicks in a very fast way while people are speaking. Anyway, so for the next few minutes, we'll be thinking about walking humbly. And I must admit, I am not one of the most humble people. So the word humility doesn't always strike me as a good thing. Precisely because I'm always thinking about myself as someone who's always been on the receiving end of a bit of violence, as many of you would possibly be able to agree. The word humility doesn't strike me as a very good concept because it will always, be humble. Martin, brilliant presentation, gracious constraint. I'm like, okay, I'm so proud of myself. I haven't sworn thus far, so I shan't start now. But F no is what I think when people say I should be humble because, people like me and like many of us have always been forced to graciously constrain ourselves, much to our detriment. But still, I think there's something profound in the concept of humility. And so, okay, maybe just briefly again what we've been doing in the last few hours, last 24 hours perhaps, much less. We first thought about the people of the way and their message. Then we thought earlier about what it means, what it may mean to pursue the good in us, the good to which God calls us. And now we'll be thinking about how it might be possible to move towards being humble or pursuing humility. And so again, we are reminded of the words of Micah 6, verse 8. God has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And so on that note, I would love to hear from you. Who comes to mind when you hear the word humble? Who comes to mind when you now? I actually want actual examples now, so please feel free to share and tell us why you consider them someone that comes to mind when you think of the word humility or humble. Anyone?
I feel like fame is so antithetical to humility. I cannot point to a single famous person that I'm aware of and go, that's a humble person, because you're famous, right? You're constantly getting photographed, or you have journalists following you, or this or that or the other. And you implicitly consent to that. Because you continue to be famous, right? You continue engaging with the media that's making you famous. So therefore, even people who I might say, they give the impression of being humble, I don't necessarily know if I can say, oh, that's a humble person.
I hear you. I hear you. But would you like to share someone that gives you that impression? Some semblance of humility?
Some semblance of humility. Okay, this might be controversial because I'm not actually a massive fan of this person, but I think Mother Teresa gave the impression of being a humble person for a lot of her life. Certain actions that she did abroad were a bit white savoury and not exactly great, but she certainly gave that impression, like humility and motherliness and all this kind of stuff.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in your personal life that might not be
in my
famous,
personal life,
who does not have 10,000 followers, but you consider
definitely my mum. I think my mum almost to a self-deprecating degree. Like, she seems incapable of saying something nice about herself and like saying, oh, I'm actually really good at this. So she's definitely an inspiration for me. I'm a very humble person, but I would like her to be able to recognise her own way as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for gifting us both those names.
My granddad, he's called David. He's an absolute legend. He's a Sealy vicar, but like he would give up everything for literally anyone, and has spent his life doing that. I think he is very much a. When I think of when you hear about people who are like gifting of things, and like when you like hear the phrase of like, oh, they give you anything, I'm like, no, David really would. Like, Granddad would give you everything. He would sell anything if it meant you were able to have things, and he has just spent his life being like just a parish priest and like just doing everything that comes with, and not necessarily recognising for himself how much of a difference he'll have made to like thousands of people. And I think, Granddad.
Thank you.
Okay, we have not the slightly problematic church I've been moaning about today, but my Oxford church. We have an outreach worker for transgender and non-conforming people, and she is, I would say, one of the top humble people I know. Her name is Chrissy, and so for example, she's been in this role nearly 2 years now, and she has just started creating a document, like a framework for safeguarding LGBT people in the church, and she's asked people to I need to do it, but I need to proofread it. I've been asked to give contributions. Now, what I say, what's humble about is that that's for the church that she is employed by. So this is a church who is already committed to equality in the church, but we the humility is knowing that we still need a safeguarding framework for this. We can't just rely on the fact that we all mean well. And I think that's a very humble thing to do, is actually say, you know what, we can also make mistakes, even if you're a church, for example, or something like SCM that considers ourselves a progressive student-led faith and action thing. We still need the frameworks. So that's something. She's an example of putting what I would call humility into practice, I think.
Thank you.
Cesar Chavez, the labor organizer, I think, even when he was fighting such a just fight, even at the height of his power, the way that he fasted and did pilgrimage and really still humbled himself, both to his abuela and to God, was a really powerful show of humility.
Thank you. Yes.
My minister's husband, who is a professor of theology and has a stupid number of titles before his name. He's always the person doing worship at the end of the service. It's always the first person on the copy rotor. And he could be really everyone could be teach us your wisdom, but that's not what he feels his place is in the church. I think that's really inspiring.
John Bell. So he was the former Lutheran community, the big Church of Scotland person for a lot of hymns. But because my dad's member, and he's just it's wonderful. But the fact that when I talk to him, he talks to me. It doesn't go, oh, you're Stuart's daughter, I know him. It's no, you are you. I want to hear about you, not your dad, not your mum, you. It's just the work that he's done, it just feels he could be because he's sold so many songs and he's quite popular in America, he could be but he's not, he's just a person, he's pretty regular.
Anyone else? Yes.
We were saying about your person reminded me actually of how much I like the current Pope actually, because he lives in an apartment with other old people and cooks himself and has done away with circumstances of circumstance around privacy, and I think that's been a really important part of moves towards synodality and reconnecting with people on the level.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, wow. Thank you for all of you sharing. That's been amazing. So now the next question. So how often do you think of yourself as humble? Yo, that's usually been my thing, right? Like when I say I'm humble, how can one say that about oneself? It's like something someone attributes to you. It's like, Tom is humble. I shouldn't say Ashwin is humble. But how often do you think of yourself as journeying into a greater form of humility? How often are you trying to do that?
I don't know.
Please go ahead.
Please. I'm sorry if that was rhetorical, but I think quite often, especially for yourself, if you think of yourself as humble, normally you'll think of self-deprecating stuff. So or for me anyway, but I still I can never be humble and stuff. But I think a lot of not calling yourself humble is self-deprecation rather than actually being humble. But yeah, I still think it would be quite hard for someone to call themselves humble and actually be humble.
Yeah. Anyone else would like to share? Yes.
The first name that popped into my mind was Uriah Heep, the Dickens character who is famously not humble, but constantly calls himself humble. And it's interesting because the Church of England, certainly in our diocese at the moment, is very competitive and not healthy, really. This isn't going out live anywhere, is it? And the not getting yourself drawn into that and not getting into that competitive place of, oh, my church is doing this or I'm doing that and stuff, sort of forces you, I have to every so often just, when I'm getting riled up and thinking I want to get cross about something or, that somebody's been given a job that they're not really qualified for no good reason and all these sorts of stuff. Having to just think, no, God is doing what God is doing with me and the church I'm blessed to be part of. So I guess, I'm wondering that kind of, it's not exactly humility, but it's that we think of it as something very, for me it's a responsive thing rather than an active thing. It's how it's not reacting to stuff.
Anyone else would like to share? Yes.
So this past Lent, actually, humility was one of my focus points, and one of the things I was sort of, reading about and praying about and asking for, God, just show me some humility. Now, God definitely answered that prayer in the sense that me and my friend had a falling out, and I was in the wrong. I was completely in the wrong here. The way I behaved towards him was honestly quite unacceptable and quite unchristian in that sense, as in just wasn't a very nice person, and I let him down when I shouldn't have. Anyway, it's not really great. However, in passive-aggressive British fashion, I think if we was most of my other friends, we would have never had a confrontation about this. We would have kind of let it sit for a couple of weeks, texted a few apologies, and then not touched it again. My friend, who wasn't having this, fully took me to coffee, right? He's like, Anna, we are literally going to address the elephant in the room. We're going to address this situation between us. And he fully just goes, this is what you did, this is how it accepted. This is where we went wrong, this is where our communication failed, this is how you didn't help yourself, didn't help me, And the fact that he, just full on, head on, with absolutely no qualms about, our friendship falling apart, was just like, Anna, here's how your behaviour wasn't great, here's how, was humbling, to say the least. It was very, very humbling. But it was so necessary. Because there are so few, there are 3 people on this entire planet, including my mum and my sister and this one friend, who would do that, who would actually directly tell me, this is not how you should be behaving, and say that to my face, and not be worried about our friendship falling apart and me never talking to him again. And that was really important and humbling, and I did come away from that conversation thinking okay, I have things to work on, so yeah. Prayed for humility, got humility.
You remind me of the time we were being for pain. Crap, God. God really, God performed. But I'm grateful for the fact that you could have that experience, though. I think the word humble or humility is like this very Christian concept of being a mystic. No one thinks of themselves as being a mystic, as being, what is the equivalent of a mystic, a different word now? Being spiritual, I mean, okay, we use that word rather loosely these days, but a mystic, someone who devotes their time to an active prayer life. And I think most of us tend to do that, but we wouldn't use I don't sit and have esoteric dreams at night. So I wouldn't use the word mystic in reference to myself. But most of us are probably well on our way to getting there. And my hunch is most of us are probably more humble than we think that we are. And so one of the first things I would like us to entertain, the first idea I would like us to entertain is thinking that humility ought to be self-deprecation. And I'm saying that intentionally because oftentimes the world in which we live, the systems under which we are expected to lead our lives requires unhealthy self-deprecation. Well, self-deprecation cannot be healthy, but requires self-deprecation. And it requires a very unhealthy self-awareness. And that is the first thing I think we should really make sense of. In which ways, I think I should be asking myself more intentionally, in which ways is the life that I'm leading not the humility to which God is calling me? In which ways are the sacrifices that I am presently making not the life to which God is calling me? And the one thing I might have failed to say in the previous two sessions was the discomfort, especially in the first session, the discomfort I think God might be calling many of us to journey into is not violent spaces. I'm quite convinced. And when I say violent spaces, I mean you would be God has a way of being very clear on when you should enter spaces that aren't particularly safe. But I'm not saying we should remain in circumstances that threaten our safety or enter those circumstances because of the calling towards discomfort. I don't think God is calling anyone to I don't think God calls our lives to be in actual harm. I think there are moments to which God does entrust that calling, but it is ours to discern. So the discomfort to which I was alluding to was not so much the discomfort to go and offer yourself up now to be on the Ukrainian border. And maybe God is calling some of us to that. I do not know. But I'm asking us to be very intentional in devoting ourselves to discernment, to figure out where is that discomfort. Oftentimes, the discomfort might just be us to make sense and wrestle with the fact that we enjoy a great deal of privilege. And also to use our privilege for the benefit of others. So, humility basically is not self-deprecation. I would like to play a clip of the American theologian. Let me just unmute myself. Well, the thing. And actually makes sense. You can hear it. There we go. The American theologian and Lutheran pastor Nadia Balz-Weber, who speaks, and someone here had a book, Accidental Saints. I'm not sure who had the book, but I saw the cover page. And she has a few minutes where she speaks about, well, let her speak for herself.
No matter if you believe the devil is an actual being or the human forces of evil or just the shadow side of our own beings, we all know the voice of the accuser. The voice of shame in our heads, that's the accuser. The accusing voice that tells me that I am what I've done or that who I am is wrong. The accuser is the voice that continually updates me on the current distance between my ideal self and my actual self, between my ideal personality and my actual personality, between my ideal weight, like my driver's license weight, and my actual weight. It makes us go to ridiculous lengths to try to prove it right or to try to prove it wrong. The accuser may try and convict us of the distance between our ideal self and our actual self, but the truth is, no one has ever become their ideal self. It's a moving target, a mirage of water on a desert road. The more we struggle to reach it, the thirstier we become, and yet we come no closer to actual water. And I'm not saying that God will get you to the mirage. What I'm saying is that the self who God loves, the self who God is in a relationship with, is your actual self. God isn't waiting for you to become thinner or heterosexual or married or celibate or more ladylike or less crazy or more spiritual or less of an alcoholic in order to love you. Also, I would argue, since your ideal self doesn't exist, it would follow that the you everyone in your life loves is your actual self too.
And so I think what I'm thinking through right now is when we think about humility, oftentimes it requires us to sort of devote all of our time to become this person that we might not actually be. Devote our attention to being intentionally self-deprecating. And so, I mean, I was raised as a very good Reformed person. And, you know, like Reformed, like Calvinist vibes. Like my parents taught me, you don't buy things on a Sunday. Like that Reformed. And so, I mean, bordered on, you shouldn't have too much fun on a Sunday because it's a Sabbath and all of those things. And oftentimes that focus on piety, because that is what they had thought it to be, the focus on piety, on leading a spiritual life, one of austerity and one of humility, requires an actual facade. So the idea of being a very joyful person oftentimes is people directly would say it's in contradiction to being humble. And I don't think that is the type of humility God is inviting us to. I think God is inviting us to a humility in which we make peace with who we are as individuals and to a recognition that in the face of others, I am able to see the fullness of God's creation and recognize that I don't have it all figured out. I think that is the form of humility. And that form of humility requires a greater self and a more healthy self-awareness. So one of my favorite theologians at the moment is the late Archbishop Desmond Mpilo Tutu, who passed on at the end of last year. And he, of course, is this famous South African theologian. And he, when you said that about how famous people don't bring the idea of humility to you, that really struck me because I've never met the Arch. But one thing from people who have met him, so maybe this may not be true, but one thing that they've all inculcated to me was the fact that he was someone with a profound sense of humility. Someone who, because he believed that God loved us, could devote his life. I think he was a true sense mystic, but he could devote his life to leading. Well, he could devote himself to leading a life that displayed a sense of humility in which he recognized that there is humanity in the face of others, but more so that the recognition of the humanity of others requires us to speak truth to power, requires us to pass the mic. And so he said the following regarding humility and forgiveness. And this might respond to your question that you had earlier. He said, we are able to forgive because we are able to recognize our shared humanity. We are able to recognize that we are all fragile, vulnerable, flawed human beings capable of thoughtlessness and cruelty. We also recognize that no one is born evil and that we are all more than the worst thing we have done in our lives. Ultimately, it is humble awareness of our own humanity that allows us to forgive. We are, every one of us, so very flawed and so very fragile. So the life of humility to which I think God is calling us while we are doing justice and while we are loving mercy is the recognition that in order to be humble, I should devote myself more adequately to forgiveness. Again, the relationship thing, to forgive others and to forgive myself, especially when I feel like I'm not worthy of forgiveness. So when I think about two icons of humility, of people who devoted their lives to ensuring that others' lives are not precarious, but are able to lead dignified lives. You probably know the photo of the person on your right. Okay. Who would like to say who that person is? Anyone? Yes. Please tell us more.
She was a drag queen who was in New York at the time of Stonewall riots.
Yes. And for most of her life after Stonewall, she devoted her life to ensuring that people have access to healthcare with regards to HIV and AIDS. And she was also rather committed Christian. And of course, as you are aware, at the time it was not exactly a great time to be queer. But this is someone that I think shows me a form of humility in the care that she had for others. The person on your left is a South African anti-apartheid activist, Simon Nkoli, who was very much deep in the trenches of the anti-apartheid struggle. However, as activism often, when people end up in power, they forget the comrades who were fighting with them. And so Simon was an out gay man, and when the African National Congress entered into parliament, when they became the government, many of them had forgotten of his contribution to the struggle. And many of them had forgotten. Even so, while they were drafting the current South African Constitution, they did include one very important thing, that we cannot discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation. And I think that might be because they were friends with him, but Simon Nkoli is also the first person, he was a constitutive part of organizing the first Pride in Africa. And that was in the late 90s, and that happened in Johannesburg. And so I think all of us, we've mentioned people that remind us of a life of humility, and in each of them, all of them, we see that what is required is not a sense of shame, but a commitment to love, a commitment to recognizing the dignity of all of creation, and a commitment to love oneself. And so, as I wrap this up, because I do not have much else to say, I want to invite you to think of the life of humility to which you might be called as being invited to explore, to think through those opportunities in which you may be vulnerable, to think of humility as similar to vulnerability. And as many of you are aware, I need not speak about vulnerability because Brene Brown will do so on my behalf. And so I gladly offer you this short clip.
So I think the biggest myth about vulnerability is that it's weakness. I think a lot of people were raised to believe that. It was modeled, I think, certainly in our culture. We see that a lot, that to be vulnerable, to be open, to be exposed is to be weak. And the truth is, what I found in my research is that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, I would argue that it's our greatest measure of courage. When we went out and asked people, what is vulnerability? We heard things like, vulnerability is the the first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is starting my own company. Vulnerability is taking responsibility for something that went wrong at work. Vulnerability is sitting with my wife who has stage 3 breast cancer and making plans for our young kids. Vulnerability is taking my business public. You know, the definition I use in my work of vulnerability is simply uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Vulnerability is about the willingness to show up and to be seen even when there are no guarantees. And it's interesting to me, I mean, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I gave a talk, it's probably a couple of years now, and it was being translated by people doing American Sign Language, and they came up before the talk started and they said, are there any words that you're going to use a lot in your talk that we should know about that might be different? And I said, well, I use the word vulnerability a lot. And they kind of, there were two of them, they kind of looked at each other and they said, oh, we do this for vulnerability. And I said, what does that mean? They said, it means weak in the knees. And I'm like, wow, that's not how I talk about vulnerability. And she said, well, there's only one other sign for vulnerability. And I said, what is it? And she said, and I said, oh, that's what I'm talking about. And so to me, vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage. I mean, it's pretty powerful when I have 13,000 pieces of data collected over 12 years that I cannot find a single incident or story of courage that was not completely underpinned by vulnerability. I think the problem arises that there's so many little paradoxes with vulnerability, and one of them is that vulnerability is courage in you, but weakness in me. When I meet you, it's the first thing I look for in you, but it's the last thing I want to show you in me. And so I think to really put ourselves out there, knowing that if we do that enough, we're going to fail, I just don't think it gets more courageous than that.
So finally, basically, I would just like to say, watch the entire TED Talk, because I do think there's power in vulnerability. But one of the things when I was preparing this, when I was thinking about speaking, the one thing I really thought about was how many of us in the room are queer, and how many of us have been to Pride, and how many of us has done so because of particular understanding of humility. Now, to be sure, most of us did not think of ourselves as going to some place, and an event such as Pride as being humble. I mean, it possibly is. I mean, it's a vice. So I mean, we don't really call it a humble event, but many have done so because of particular awareness of our vulnerability, of the ways in which we are called to do justice and to love mercy and to move into humility. And so next time you go to Pride, as many of us will do, go in the knowledge that you are doing so because you're moving into humility. Thank you very much.
We've got just through.
Holding ourselves accountable, but not eating ourselves up over something that we can't be. So holding ourselves accountable is maybe hearing other people's voices and kind of lifting up the marginalised and so on, but at the same time not beating ourselves up like, oh, I didn't do this, and I didn't stand up there, and I didn't do this and that.
Well, journal. I think journaling is important. I think to remain friends with people that don't always agree with you, and I'm not saying be friends with homophobes or sexists, please try and stay clear. Well, I mean, be friends with them, but I don't think those are the best accountability partners. But I've found that the best way I could be held accountable was to be in a relationship with people who don't exist in my positionality, whose identity markers are different from mine, and who are also serious, and we tell each other this. Our friendship is predicated on us wanting the best for each other, and for that reason we hold each other accountable. The nitty-gritties of how one makes that friendship work, I think each grouping of people would have to figure that for themselves out. But one of the ways in which one is able to do that is to recognize oftentimes the way in which one is privileged in each setting. So it requires a continued contextual analysis. There are certain moments where I, as a man, hold more power than a woman friend. A friend is a woman, and then I need to learn to pass the mic. There are certain times when a straight person would have to learn to pass the mic to my side, and there are times when I need to pass the mic because I'm cis as well. So in those moments, I think one is able to hold oneself accountable, is able to be held accountable. But I think journaling helps us to gesture away from continued self-deprecation. Look, also, I'm not saying sometimes feeling bad is good. Please. We do need to feel bad at times, but we need to do so in ways that are healthy for ourselves. Yes.
Yeah, I liked the clip you had from Nadia Bolz-Weber about kind of this idea of sort of being a critic or negative self-image and how that's not a positive thing. I just wondered what you thought about that, just kind of in relation to sort of attitudes or behaviors that we're called to have as Christians that we may or may not achieve. If you'd see that as related to that, or that as a separate thing to what she was talking about.
Yeah, I do think it's related. I don't think she's suggesting that we shouldn't be self-sacrificial. I do think there are moments in our lives where we are called to it, where God is pressing upon our hearts to offer ourselves up sacrificially. I'm just thinking that she's suggesting, I don't think you're supposed to do that 24/7. Those are the ways in which it becomes unhealthy and it becomes spiritually abusive. So I think they are related, but she's trying to say it requires what Paul warned us of, I think it's Paul, to test the spirits, to always be discerning. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.